Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, here with another dispatch from the front. Very interesting story here today. This is from Bloomberg, Ben Schott. Money, morality, and what religion has to do with it. In Plato's Euthyphro, you can tell I haven't read it, Socrates poses a timeless question: is that which is holy loved by the gods because it is holy, or is it holy because it is loved by the gods? From this arises an equally thorny theological dilemma. Does morality derive exclusively from divinity, or can one be good without God? Luckily for the second question, at least, we have data. Around the world, 45% of the people said that a belief in God was necessary to be moral and have good values, according to a Pew Research Center poll of 38,426 people in 34 countries conducted from May to October 2019. Of course, within this headline stat are a swath of regional demographic and socioeconomic variations in most countries surveyed, considering piety a prerequisite for morality was more common among the elderly, and it tended to be associated with the political right. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the U.S. had the widest ideological gap of any of the countries surveyed, whereas on average 44% of Americans said that morality depends on religiosity. That number diverged significantly by political leaning: 24% on the left, 37% in the center, and 63% on the right. This 39% right-left ideological balance compares to 24% in Canada, 15% in the UK, and 9% in Sweden. Slovakia was the only country polled where this political divide was reversed. 16% more left-leaning Slovakians said piety and morality are linked than those on the right. Some of the most interesting variations emerged when divinity and morality were juxtaposed with wealth. As the chart below illustrates, those living in advanced economies were less likely to link morality with divinity than those in emerging or developing economies. For instance, in Kenya, which had a gross domestic product per capita of $4,509 in 2019, 95% said the belief in God was integral to being moral. In Sweden, where the GDP figure was 55,815, only 9% felt the same. There are many reasons for such disparities, not least the links between wealth and education, as well as the rise of secular morality concerning causes such as climate change, gender fluidity, and racial equality. Together they raise doubts about another Socratic pronouncement: wealth does not bring goodness, but goodness brings wealth. We're going to need another poll. Well, and you'll be able to see the graph if you click on the link at the website here, but let me just describe it to you. The headline on the graph is God versus Mammon. Richer countries are less likely to link morality with a belief in God. The y-axis here is the percent who say it is necessary to believe in God in order to be moral and have good values. The x-axis is the 2019 GDP per capita, PPP, current international dollars, from the Pew Center polling here. And you see a cluster, it's fairly wide dispersion. They've drawn a regression line through it, but when you look at the regression line, there's 2 data points that run through the regression line. As shown on the graph here is a couple of dozen data points. And I'd be interested in knowing, they don't give it on the graph, but I'd want to know how well that regression line fits the data, because there are a lot of outliers here, not least of which is the U.S. The U.S. has a much higher percentage of people who say it is necessary to believe in God, along with having the higher GDP. So the U.S. is a gigantic outlier, and when you consider that that's averaged, and as they noted in the article, there's basically 2 camps in the U.S. on this. One is much higher at 63%. They're about half. than the other, which is much lower. So the much lower one would much better support their theory here. And if they hadn't averaged it in this way, it would certainly show something different. This is a dot plot or scatter plot, and it's not really well served because there's one data point for each of these, and yet the underlying data is really a distribution. It's a range. And so the way they should show this is through the use of a graph that's called a box plot. And what a box plot looks like is kind of like an I-beam with a foam pad wrapped around it, is the best way I can describe it. It's a square in the middle, and somewhere within that square there will be a line that gives you an idea of where the mean is. The exact middle of that square, as you look at it, will be where the median is. And then the 25% and below value will be at the bottom, and the 75% and above value will be at the top of the box. They'll represent the lines making the top and bottom of the box. Then there'll be these whiskers that come out of it, and what they represent is the rest of the dispersion. A box plot is kind of like if you were to look at a normal distribution and a regular distribution too. If you look at a distribution from the top down, so if you picture that graph with a bell curve or with whatever shape the distribution has, log, normal, whatever, and if you were to look at it from above, a box plot is kind of what you would see. That would be the more appropriate way to show it. But if they showed it that way, it would completely blow up their thesis. Now, I would bet that when you run the actual numbers, you're not going to find that they can support the hypothesis that they've got here. There's just too many outliers. So there are religious countries such as the U.S., such as Turkey, such as Philippines, which run the gamut in terms of GDP per capita, and yet are very religious, so they're way off the chart. There are countries that are extremely secular. Ukraine, Russia. But again, they weren't always that secular, and there are ranges there, because obviously the Russian Orthodox faith is very strong in both the Ukraine and Russia, so there's a sizable minority population which is very faithful. But you've got a bunch of formerly communist atheists, and the other thing they don't draw attention to is heavily socialist countries are very irreligious. So it really puts paid to the notion of liberation theology in a lot of ways, because you can see that all these countries that are bowing towards the belief that you don't need to believe in God in order to be good, all these countries are the usual socialist suspects. And you can see that especially in the case of, say, France, which used to be a Catholic country, but now is one of the least religious countries in Europe. So anyway, do take a look at that graph. As always, you have to kind of look deeper within the data. But what they are claiming to show is not what is shown in that graph. Well, let's talk about the deeper issue here. So, as atheism has grown across the West, it has been common for atheists to bridle at the notion that you need to be religious in order to be moral. Some atheists wish to be perceived as being just as good, just as noble, just as virtuous as anyone who has a religious faith. And so they've reacted quite defensively to the notion that one must believe in a higher power in order to be a good person. Of course, it's always difficult to get examples of such people. And when you look at some of the more commonly known examples of atheist regimes, you're up against the fact that you've got the communists, you've got the Nazis, and they didn't have the best track record in terms of virtuous behavior. So they're looking for the equivalent of a noble pagan among the atheists, and they keep running into things like, well, Voltaire wasn't a very good person. You know, when your most famous advocates, your evangelical atheists, as it were, live kind of tawdry lives, it really hurts your thesis. It makes it more difficult. So theoretically, you can say, well, sure. The fact of the matter is that there is such a thing known as natural law, which is written on every man's heart. And so in theory, that should certainly be sufficient. The question is whether it is so in practice. For the Catholic, there's not much in dispute here because the natural law comes from God. And so the notion that you could be moral without God is just an impossibility. But you couldn't really be anything without God. You wouldn't exist. And in fact, to work acts of evil, you rather have to turn away from the natural law and from God. So when we look at what we value in terms of morality, the article tries to inject political causes and imbue them with a morality. That's a little bit like stealing a base. But clearly, atheists and socialists recognize that there is something to be said for being viewed as a moral person, as a virtuous person. In fact, the only modern movement, well, there were two modern movements, but we'll talk about the one that is more mainstream. The only modern movement which really challenged the notion of virtue as a value in and of itself was objectivism. Ayn Rand wrote a book encompassing her philosophy, nonfiction, which was even called The Virtue of Selfishness, in which she tried to make the case that one's loyalty ought to be to one's own desires first, and that it was a crime against the self to require that someone sacrifice themselves for another. Objectivism was fairly popular in the 50s, took off a bit in the 60s. Alan Greenspan used to run the Fed, was one of Ayn Rand's circle in New York. As a young man, he later renounced some of the tenets of objectivism and earned Rand's wrath in the process later on. But at the time, it was a bit of an intellectual fad, especially on the right. But Whittaker Chambers of National Review, who famously was the person who identified Alger Hiss as being a Soviet spy. Alger Hiss had worked in the State Department. Chambers himself was a former communist. And when Chambers testified against Hiss, it was really an epic-making event that doesn't get as much play as it really ought to, because it revealed a couple of things that weren't known before. Number one was that communists had totally infiltrated America's ruling class. One of the reasons Hiss nearly walked away unscathed from the accusations was that it was viewed that Hiss was a good old Ivy League boy and that surely he couldn't do something like that. Whereas Chambers, the admitted ex-communist, homosexual, very rumpled appearance, he looked a bit like Orson Welles in Touch of Evil. How could that guy be telling the truth? Well, it turned out that guy was telling the truth. And so Chambers famously took Ayn Rand out of the conservative movement in much the same way Buckley had the John Birchers in the 60s when he wrote a review of Atlas Shrugged with the headlines, "To a gas chamber go." I'm sorry, that may have been the final line. "To a gas chamber go." That was a devastating summary of a philosophy that really shook Rand and the objectivists to the core. But what also put them to the pale was that Rand lived a very scandalous life with an open marriage, chasing after much younger men. She was a literary doyenne who kind of lived that bohemian lifestyle to the fullest. And that didn't sit right with more traditional conservatives. And so the objectivists were kind of run out of town. But for the rest of humanity, you have to at least look like you care about other people. And so there's a utility to being perceived as being a moral, virtuous person in the West to this day, which is a bit incongruous with the modernist belief, especially on the left. And I would argue that what we actually see in that data is that the West is yet split into two camps of varying size depending on the country. In France, virtually everyone is a modernist. That makes them materialists. They don't have a spiritual sense at all. That also makes them sexual libertines. They don't practice the time-honored sexual morality of the West. It also makes them more receptive to the programs of the left in that regard, where groups that engage in what would be considered sexual perversion elsewhere are met with a shrug. You see this famously in the case of France, where when it came to, for example, to adultery on the part of their political leaders, the French just shrug, much like the Italians do. Whereas in other parts of Europe and the Americas, that would be a bigger deal. Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are still married. If anyone thinks it's anything like a loving marriage, well, I've got a chamois to sell them. And then you have the traditionalist camp. In France, it's very small. In the United States, it's much larger. These are the folks, like myself, who hold to the time-honored Western values, and they are far, far more religious than the modernist camp. Now, that said, even within religious communities, there will always be a modernist camp and a traditionalist camp. We have this in the Catholic Church. I attend the traditional Latin Mass. My family and I drive an hour one way every Sunday just so we can attend the traditional Latin Mass. There is a Mass that is right here in our town, which is the exact opposite of a traditional Latin Mass. The new liturgy since Vatican II is referred to as the Novus Ordo. And then even within the Novus Ordo, there is a wide variety of liturgical abuse which goes on in full disobedience to the rules that have been laid down by the church without penalty whatsoever. And so when you go to these churches, like the one we have here in town, for example, gone are the magnificent buildings and the pews and the kneelers, the communion rail. And instead, people sit on a bunch of folding chairs and listen to bands with guitars play. Confession is not in a divided area. You cannot see a priest and he cannot see you. Rather, it's done face to face in a reconciliation room. Those sorts of things. And they mark the dividing line between the traditionalists and the modernists. And in the Catholic Church, even with a reputation for being stodgy old Catholics, drawing our traditions back to the apostolic age, even within the Catholic Church, the modernists far, far outnumber the traditionalists. In America as a whole, we do far better. The traditionalists are probably roughly half, depending on how you construe it. But basically, when I talk about traditionalists in the American context, I'm talking about people who respect the flag, who respect the founding principles, who respect the Constitution of the United States. In terms of morality, it's your typical American morality. Honest, steadfast, true. Word is bond. Love your country, love your neighbor. Those kind of things. Versus the modernist view, which is the hip, the happening now, whatever cause happens to roll down the pike, whatever change you're expected to swallow, they swallow it. Where the only virtue that's owned is open-mindedness and tolerance, but even that's not practiced. Because the same people who claim that we must be open-minded and tolerant will turn around and call you a bigot and a phobe and whatever the second they realize that you disagree with whatever the latest cause is, or you're insufficiently devoted to it. I had the experience recently when I posted on Facebook. There was a meme regarding George Floyd, and it pointed out George Floyd's criminal record. And my response to it was that look at the dates on the record. He hadn't been in trouble since 2007, according to that meme. So either he was up to no good and just somehow managed to get away with it for all that time, or more likely, in my opinion, the events and the stresses that had hit us over the last few months may have sent him into a spiral of addiction. And that may be the reason that he wound up having the police called on him. And in any case, you can have a criminal record, and it's still wrong for a cop to kneel on your neck until you die. It just is. But that post was deemed insufficiently supportive of George Floyd. And I had a leftist I know threaten all sorts of things in response to that post. And that's what, if you're going to be a modernist, that is what you will have to learn to deal with, is that the goalposts are always moving, and if you catch yourself outside the goalpost, you had better publicly apologize and get back into the fold, or else. So I think what we're seeing in that data is just the continuing battle for the heart and soul of the West between the modernists and the traditionalists. And it's been going on for centuries, really, when you get right back down to it. And it comes down to what you value. I value time-honored principles. Does that mean that our ancestors were perfect? No. But what it means is that we don't dismiss them out of hand simply because they lived before we did. You have to think often about how they viewed it when they were alive. And how, for example, a Confederate may have thought ill of, say, the Puritans who came over for their intolerance in support of their religion. They fled England because of intolerance, not least of which caused by themselves because they had a very prominent role in the English Civil War and wound up losing in the end. But they came to this country supposedly to practice their religion and implemented all sorts of oppression associated with it. And so a Confederate may well have looked at a Puritan with much disdain. But given that the Confederates were defending the institution of slavery, perhaps they should have focused a little bit more on the moral implications of their own day and what they were doing, and examined that a little bit more closely through a lens of morality and virtue. Perhaps their time would have been better spent and less blood would have been shed over it. And that goes for any people, not simply Confederates. That was just a handy example. But you have to be careful. We talked in another podcast about humility, and it pays to be humble when you think of people from another time. Because you have to remember, those same people may look very dimly at our own day. For example, no matter how bad the Confederates were, they didn't kill their children the way we do. They didn't treat their elderly the way we do. They didn't treat their poor the way we do. And so there's much to criticize on the part of our ancestors for the way we live our lives today, just as there is ourselves looking in the mirror and saying, oh, those benighted fools, they just didn't know any better. It pays to have a little bit of that humility when you look at it. And as a traditionalist, I view it as you need to understand the value of what you have before you discard it. Nowhere could this be clearer than with this pandemic, where we have in a second dispensed with the First Amendment rights that so many Americans have died to obtain for us and to preserve for us down these centuries, as though they were nothing. As though the government saying that there's an emergency was sufficient to just put the Constitution in permanent obsolescence. This emergency was supposed to last 2 weeks. Legislatures can meet. So why is it that we still have governors with dictatorial powers? How does that work in a free nation of free men? To the modernist, well, returning to the days of the tribal strongman is just the right side of history. That's the common refrain whenever you look at modernist thought. It's never about the small liberties of, say, your local village, as it was back in the day, where people had wide latitude in how they governed themselves. Modernists are totalitarians. It is about the better among us deciding how we will get to live our lives. It's how it's always been. Ever since modernism first reared its ugly head, not long prior to the bloody French Revolution, where modernism had, coincidentally, its greatest triumph. As the guillotine worked overtime and the heads dropped into the baskets, and the women screamed, and the blood flowed through the streets of Paris and the other French cities and provinces and towns. So, my friends, as you take a look at data like this and questions that on the face of them seem fairly simple, fairly easy, I ask that you consider the full weight of history and that you understand that today is not a new day. It wasn't birthed ex nihilo, but rather it's the latest link in a chain going back further than humanity can remember. We are not utterly new creations each dawn. There's a history, and that history can be learned from and should be learned from. And that part of realizing a mature view of the world is to understand that men cannot be gods. That's ultimately where the modernists have it wrong. That's ultimately what drives so much of their anger and hatred as they realize that their utopian plans can never come to fruition. Utopia, by the way, was coined by Thomas More, who was a famed clergyman. And what I'll leave you with today, my friends, is the etymology of the word utopia. For utopia literally means no place. Have a great day.